Hello and welcome to the Somerset Archaeological and Natural History Society, which is usually known as SANHS. My name's Lizzie Induni and I'm a trustee for SANHS. Today we're going to hear a talk from David Dawson. David is an archaeologist with over 50 years experience of working in the museum and heritage sector. He was appointed Somerset County Museums Officer and Curator of the Society's Museum Collections in 1985, a position he held until his retirement in 2004. He has served as a trustee and honorary treasurer for SANHS and is currently a holding trustee, chair of the Heritage Grants Committee, secretary to the Museum Collections Panel and convener of the Archaeology Committee. Last year, he served as president of the Society. David's main interest now is pottery, and he's involved in the Somerset Medieval and Post-Medieval Pottery Fabric Type Series funded by Historic England. As usual, David will take questions at the end of the talk. To ask questions, you'll need to activate the chat button at the bottom of the page and type in a question. Because we're recording this lecture, we won't use names in question time. It's free to register for the talks, but a donation of £5 towards the ongoing costs of SANHS would be greatly appreciated. The donations button is on the SANHS website donations page. When donating, please label your donation presidential address. To make things easier, a link to the donations page will also be posted on the chat button at the end of the lecture. So, David.
Thank you, Lizzie. Hello, everyone. I'd like to share with you this evening an address that I delivered to the annual general meeting of the Society, because it is a subject that is relatively little known to most of the Society's members, and indeed outside the Society itself. It was felt that it was important that I do a rerun this evening so that you have the opportunity of sharing the information too. Now, it is a complicated subject. I will start at the very beginning in 1849 at our first annual general meeting. And as you might imagine, quite a lot has happened since then. And to try and make sense of it, I will divide my talk up into three main sections. First, dealing with the beginnings and the growth of the collections. The second, how we actually went about tackling the problems of resources and housing the collections and care collections in the 20th century. And lastly, to look at what some of the exciting things that are happening now, which I think are signposts for the future. And indeed ways in which you can be involved. And I hope will feel that it is one of the reasons why it is worthwhile supporting the Society through your annual subscription. So to begin in the beginning, one of the objects of the Society, this is an extract from a quotation of our very first president, Walter Calverley-Trevelyan. Speaking, actually introducing the meeting of our very first annual meeting of the Society, which was held in the Market Hall here in Taunton. It was in one of the big first floor rooms. And he said quite specifically in his opening remarks that one of the objects of the Society was to establish a library and a museum. Now, it is very interesting that as part of the very fundamental reasons for establishing a county society to promote understanding and interest in the archaeology and natural history of Somerset, that the establishment of a library and a museum was seen as being an essential tool to help not only members of the Society, but the public at large, come to grips with the huge task that the Society had taken on. Now, the Reverend Dimmock, our secretary rather wistfully said that we hoped eventually to have a permanent home, but in the meantime they negotiated a room in temporary accommodation in the centre of Taunton. And as a kind of dry run to prove why a museum was important, they actually had set out in an adjoining room a collection that had been got together by various members of the society, especially for the occasion. We don't know we know what was in that collection, but we don't know where a lot of that material was, except for a few pieces, like this example here, which is it's only one of a series of panels from the Wellington reredos, dating from the 14th century. You'll find this referred to, incidentally, in the original edition of Pesner's Somerset. These were discovered when the repairs were being made, and indeed the chancel was being rebuilt at the parish church at Wellington. And in those days, the parish priest actually owned the chancel. And so it was in his gift to eventually give the series of stones that were recovered to the society and its collections. Not all the reredos survived, unfortunately, but a fair number of the panels have, and you could see they're of very fine quality indeed. The first edition of Proceedings, incidentally, was accompanied by a paper by Mr. C. Giles explaining the wonders of this particular find. The rich collection that our president alluded to, that he hoped we would amass, actually, we did so very, very quickly indeed. The Society in those days published annual lists of its acquisitions to its museum, and it reads like a huge kaleidoscope of material. For example, one of the early collections that was recorded was Mr. Moore's of a rich collection of fossil fish and insects from the Lias in Ilminster. Now, this we now know to be a very important collection since augmented, but is an important collection of very finely preserved fossil material from the strawberry fields at Ilminster. Now, it so happened that while we were doing this, and incidentally, this particular example, of course, is of a noticed tarder, the great bustard, which was declared extinct in 1832. So it's an example of how much earlier material found its way into our collections from 1849 onwards. Some of this material actually dates back in collections of various kinds to the turn of the century. So it's actually quite important. We have now well over 130 years collections in our care. The a particular example that I think this actually shows is how very quickly a wide range of material was acquired. So much so that even from the very beginning, I think the museum was suffering from overcrowding. But it so happened that our society was founded at a time when it was almost fashionable to have found learned societies like ours who were willing to take on the task of actually trying to name and gather the evidence of the archaeology and natural history of their region. The first in our region in the southwest was the Bristol and Literary and Philosophical Institute, which was founded in 1821. And its collections now form the core of Bristol City Museum and Art Gallery. They were followed, and here I have to refer to my crib sheet because I never remember, terrible at remembering dates, is in 1829, the Bath Literary and Philosophical Society, Literary and Scientific Institution. In 1846, by Dorset Natural History and Archaeological Society. and in 1853 by the Wiltshire Natural History and Archaeological Society. So you can see we're part of a trend. Now, those last three, of course, are still flourishing, and their museums can be visited to this day in Bath, Dorchester, and Devizes, respectively. So it was not only an exciting time in terms of activity amongst a lot of amateur endeavour throughout the Southwest, it was also a very interesting time scientifically, because what the Society quickly found, even at our very first annual meeting, was that we were in the middle of a rather tense debate, shall we say, about the antiquity of the world. You may recall that Archbishop Usher had meticulously calculated, though he did say that there was a little bit of leeway in it, that the date of the genesis of the Earth was the 23rd of October, 4004 BC. Fine. Our vice president, the Lord Bishop of Bath and Wells, was obviously a little bit more timid when he came to make his address in the following year. And I think it turned in almost into a sermon that was a kind of plead for humility in the face of overwhelming information. What he actually meant by that, I'm still at a loss after reading very carefully his address. You could read it for yourself, it's in the proceedings. Now, part of the problem was that the concept of in archaeology at any rate, the concept of the three ages, that is the Stone Age, followed by a Bronze Age, followed by an Iron Age, had already been developed basically through study of the Royal Danish National Museum collections in Copenhagen. It was first expanded by Rasmus Nyerup in 1809, and further then refined by Christian Thompson in 1836 and Jens Forsey in 1843. So you can see the society was already, if you like, heirs to a concept that found it terribly difficult to actually cram the whole of human development within that 4004 BC timeframe that was allowed according to the church. Now, to put putting the nails into the coffin, we had then, of course, on the 1st of July, 1858, the theory of natural selection, being propounded to the Linnean Society by Alfred Wallace and Charles Darwin. And that in turn was followed by Darwin's Origin of Species in 1863. When you take that into combination with the work of Lyell, Charles Lyell, who had expounded the principles of geology back in 1833, and most importantly, the principle of uniformitarianism. What he meant by that was that the geological processes that have been at work in the past were exactly the same as the geological processes that we could see at work in our own day. Now, this, of course, was quite a fundamental challenge to this Archbishop Usher idea. And in his work, the geological evidence for the antiquity of man, which he published in 1863, he actually cites particular evidence that is rather close to the bone for us, most of us in Somerset. In 1841 onwards, a person called Boucher de Perthes had initiated a series of excavations and field work in the valleys around Abbeville and Saint-Nazaire in northern France. The kinds of artifacts that he was finding are exactly the same as you see here. And that's why these are called Acheulean hand axes. Now, these are actually from the Broome Gravels, just over the border in Devon. And indeed, now we know that certainly Archbishop Usher is false to the dust in the face of this. We now know that they date back to over 300,000 years before present. Now, these we now know are not the work of Homo sapiens. They are the work of a near cousin of ours, a predecessor known as Homo heidelbergensis, who incidentally we have good evidence to suggest were black in their pigmentation. That would have probably put an even further shock into the early society, but there we are. So that was one of the pieces of evidence that came, as I say, fairly close to the bone. Sorry for the pun, but the next finds were that Lyle cited were from what we now call Hyena Den, which is next door to Wookey Hole. And from 1857 onwards, William Boyd Dawkins and a chap called Sanford, in their excavations, they actually showed that the bones of prehistoric mammalia were intimately associated with human artifacts. Now, most of these bones were actually a bit younger, we now know, that only 25 to 55,000 years ago, but nevertheless of great antiquity and certainly well below 4004 BC. This collection, and this is an example that is on show in the Museum of Somerset to this day, the skull of what was then classified as Felis spelaea, but has now been recategorized as Panthera Leo. Now, Panthera Leo is a commoner garden lion of the kind that you see padding around in the African savanna. But quite obviously, at this period of time, it, along with so many other what we would regard now as exotic mammals, were padding the hills around Mendip. And indeed, there were hippopotami wallowing in the River Tone. So this collection actually was of vital importance. We were fortunate in actually appointing as one of our very early curators, full-time curators, a chap called William Bidgood, who served for nearly 40 years, 1862 onwards. And one of his first acts was to start organising a public subscription so that the bones from the Mendip caves that were being excavated and were still being excavated at that time could be purchased for the Society's collection. And as a result of that, Somerset now has one of the, as Andy Current pointed out in our Millennium Conference, a first-class research collection of Pleistocene mammalia. That means it's one of the most important collections there is in Britain, and indeed it is of international significance, what we have here. And I think this is a pointer to the fact that you can see this in many aspects of the collections that even right in the early days the Society was acquiring. They have significance to their own particular discipline that has ramifications over a much wider field than just Somerset. A much more minor example. It so happened that in this small collection was acquired as a result of the construction of the Anglo-Bavarian Brewery, which is still a major building standing to this day in Shepton Mallet, though sadly not producing lager anymore. It was a Roman kiln. It was identified as such. And some of the finds of complete vessels survive in the collections to this day and are important for those of us involved in archaeology and for those involved particularly in Romano British archaeology, because these are now type specimens of their own kind for this particular type of Roman pottery that was made in the 2nd to the 4th centuries AD. We would now characterize this as being part of the wider Severn Valley ware family of Roman pottery. It's not common, but it is found in quite a number of the Roman sites over the northern part of the county and well beyond, I have to add. So this is another example of where a particular find has provided a fundamental building block to the landscape that we now can, many pieces of landscape that we now can deploy to understand Somerset's past. The collections grew, and it eventually, in 1873, the opportunity arose to find a permanent home that society so desired. And it so happened that the Inner Bailey of Taunton Castle, that is the innermost bailey of the castle, together with its surrounding land, and that in those days included Castle Lodge and Aeneas Cottage. It was available for the princely sum of £3,000. The society actually managed by 1874, a year later, to raise the money it needed partly by public subscription, but to complete the deal for the princely sum of £2,850. So they actually struck a bit of a bargain there. But at the same annual general meeting, the council admitted that they would need another £400 to make the necessary alterations to the buildings, and another £1,500 for furniture and fittings, and a further £1,500 to repay a loan to Stuckey's Bank. So that was quite a big commitment, but the society quite cheerfully took that on. And as a result, it converted the Inner Bailey of the castle to accommodation for not only its museum, but also its library, the Adam Library that was just to the left-hand side of the gatehouse that you see here. It included accommodation for the curator, who then lived in the house that is to the right-hand side of the gatehouse. And it, of course, included a meeting room, which was then the Somerset Room, and offices for the society's staff. So it was an important start, and it actually secured, in a state of preservation, an important ancient monument. And this is in the days before ancient monument legislation provided any kind of preservation and protection for this kind of building. So it was an important step for the society to take, and an important undertaking. And this is still one of our most important assets that we hold to this day. The grounds, incidentally, were laid out as public gardens. The museum moved in. Fortunately, Bidgood died in 1901. So, but this is very much a kind of monument to what he managed to achieve. The whole of the museum collections were housed within the Great Hall. Now, to our modern eyes, this seems like chaos, but I assure you it is not. It is quite deliberate, didactic order. The rule was that in those days that every single item in the collection should be publicly accessible. And so you can see every single square inch of wall space has been taken up. And we've got cases lining the walls and cases down the centre of the Great Hall, including, incidentally, in the foreground on the right-hand side, some of that collection of fossil mammalia bone that the Pleistocene period that Bidgood has been so keen to secure. More delicate objects and specimens like butterflies, insects, plants were housed in drawers that could be pulled out from underneath the desk cases that you see there. So as I say, the rule was that everything, or at least as much as possible, should be on display. And it actually made sense. If you ever visited a museum that is displayed like this, and there aren't that many still around, but the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford is a good example, or the Natural History Museum's reserve collections at Tring are in good places to visit, because you can see, actually come to understand the merits of this kind of display. It doesn't fit with our modern ideas of interpretation and all the jazzy stuff that, sorry, all the whizzo stuff that we've actually recently employed. But it is an impressive site, is it not? Now, to replace Bidgood when he retired, we appointed this chap, Harold St George Gray. He came very highly recommended. He was then a curator at the Pitt Rivers Museum at Oxford. He was very well known as an archaeologist. He was Lieutenant General Pitt Rivers's right-hand man, and Pitt Rivers had died actually into the year 1900. So he was well known as being a proponent of Pitt Rivers's ideas that really we recognise still as being very much pioneer of the techniques of scientific archaeological recording and excavation. Pitt Rivers also had some very interesting ideas about how human artifacts were to be displayed and arranged to aid public understanding. And that's why I refer you to go and have a look at the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, which still follows his kinds of principles. Now, inevitably, having appointed an archaeologist, you would see a slight change in emphasis to archaeology, and indeed some important archaeological collections came our way, including, for example, here, the Yeovil Talk that was declared treasure trove in 1909. Now, of course, then it was not understood what the archaeological context of such a find was. We now know that it is part of the ornament horizon dating from the Middle Bronze Age, in other words, between about 1500 and 1000 BC, of which, incidentally, metalwork, goldwork and bronze work, Somerset is incredibly rich. We hold one of the best collections of material of this kind in the country. Now, St George Gray continued to be very much in demand elsewhere. He, for example, had already teamed up with Alexander Keeler, the marmalade magnate, who'd had enough money to actually buy the whole of Avebury, the village, the Neolithic Henge monument, the manor house, the lot. And indeed, he started moving the village out to free up the archaeological monument, and founded a new village that you can still see to this day, about a mile away. The excavations that Keeler and Gray carried out at Avebury were on an absolutely heroic scale. I wish I'd managed to keep in a slide that actually showed you this. It will give a modern archaeologist like me absolute collywobbles just looking at it, with overhanging sections and the ditch completely excavated down to a depth of about 20 feet. It's enormous, like those big the photographs you sometimes see of excavations of that date out in the Middle East. But he also devoted quite a lot of time to digging in Somerset. He was persuaded, or rather Arthur Bullied was persuaded to accept him as a co-director in continuing the excavations of the lake villages at Glastonbury. Now, these were, again, of international significance. It was only in Switzerland where the earliest lake villages had been discovered was anything like these found. Marvelous preservation of wood, leather, everything that normally archaeological deposition would consume over the years was here preserved in the peat. And we have this lovely reconstruction by Amédée Forestier for the London Illustrated News, which will give you some idea of how bustling this place was. So good was the record, incidentally, of this site that John Coles and our Steve Minnett got together, and as a result of a study of the records, produced a complete reinterpretation of the history of this village from the archaeological remains. And that has been published by the Society earlier. It is industrious and fairly prosperous. I can recommend it. Now, Gray's attention was drawn to a whole range of different monuments, from the megalithic remains at Battlegore, which I know Andy Jones and Henrietta Quinnell have been re-examining recently and are due to publish in our next copy of Proceedings, which hopefully will be out later this year. But he also found work right on his own doorstep in starting excavations at Taunton Castle. Now remember, Harold St George Gray actually lived in the house next door to the gatehouse. And the part of the castle site that the Society owned was all this area here. And he started excavations in this area behind Castle House, and between there and the curtain wall, which it ran and still does run behind north of the properties lining Law Street. You can see that here, I'm sure some of you recognize the hole, main hole he dug, which is the site of what is today called the Sunken Garden. You will also notice that there is a huge spoil heap to one side of that Sunken Garden, and that was landscaped in the future and actually masks most of the rest of the site. So it's actually covered by St George Gray's spoil heap. Now, Chris Webster, who has, of course, produced a magnificent study of the site of the castle, and I have puzzled over exactly what happened. To us, it seems that St George Gray was certainly well out of his depth, if again you forgive the pun. Why, you may ask? I mean, why didn't he apply the techniques he had learnt, which were equally applicable to a medieval site like this? Well, I think to those of us who were actually brought up in the kind of pioneering period after the Second War, when for the first time large areas of our medieval and later townships were excavated, the complexities of medieval archaeology and how to cope with them were really having to be worked out at that date. So here's poor old St George Gray 20 years earlier, trying to grapple with the same complexities and really having nobody else to refer to help him. And as an example, when Nicholas, my son, and I were engaged to tackle the pottery, not only from Chris Webster's excavations, but from the earlier excavations as well, we discovered that well over 3,000 pottery sherds, mostly medieval, from St George Gray's excavations were still preserved in the museum collections. Now, of that 3,000, he only ever published 2. And that's one of them down in the bottom corner here. And these two sherds were found at the bottom of what Gray called the Norman Well. He, I think rather somewhat naively, had assumed that these were Norman sherds. He was right there. They're very similar to sherds he'd already, kinds of sherds he'd already discovered at Castle Niroche, except that the finds in the Norman Well were actually mixed up with much later material, including metalwork from the Civil War. So quite clearly, this isn't a primary Norman deposit. But that aside, I mean, it was a heroic effort to try and make sense of the castle. And it is, as Chris Webster will avow, it is an incredibly complicated site. Now, while St. George Gray was busy doing a lot of archaeology, of course, he did other things as well. The person who made the most impact on our museum collections was his wife, Florence. She really is the unsung hero of the first half of the 20th century. She was beavering away between 1901 and 1949. And it is primarily to her efforts that we are able to actually link most of the earlier collections with the documentation that survives and to understand better the context from which they came. She spent an awful lot of her time doing this, actually applying hand-painted labels to artifacts. Here's that tankard, for example, that you saw earlier from the kiln at Shepton Marett, neatly marked up so that we know exactly where it was found, and we also know when it was given to the collection. And that in turn can be linked in with publication in the Society's proceedings. The example on the right here is one of the set of jugs. There are over 24 in total, but only a few of them have found their way into the collection, that were found at the bottom of another well at Crox Street at Donyat. Now, Donyat, we now know, thanks to the work of Richard Coleman Smith and Terry Pearson in the 1970s, was a major manufacturing centre, pottery, for Somerset and indeed for the West Country for much of the period between the end of the medieval period right up until the 19th century. But these are good examples of late 17th century products of the Donyat potteries. They've all incidentally lost their rims and very often their handles as well, because they were used for hauling water from the well. And of course, what tended to happen is that from time to time, the spout snagged in the side and you lost the jug as well as the water. And you just simply added another jug and carried on. As a result, there was a nice hoard of jugs at the bottom of the well. But in short, the important point I want to make is that how indebted we are, those of us who had to look at the care of the collections since that time, how indebted we are to Florence. She's one of the great unsung heroes of the Society. Now the collections kept on growing and growing. I keep on saying this, but they did. And some of the specimens were quite large, like the ichthyosaur you see here from the Lower Lias. This is some 10 feet or more long. And fortunately, the Society came across the best next thing to a fairy godmother in the form of William Windham in the 1930s. Windham, I'm not too sure what his family still make of him, but he managed to give away an awful lot of his fortune. He bought buildings that founded 3 other museums in the county, Bridgewater, Yeovil and Wells. And he also endowed the Society with a great deal of money, which enabled us first in 1931 to demolish the jury room, which has been replaced by the building that is now the Museum CAF and offices above. But in those days was opened actually as the main entrance to the museum, and a geology collection, including the ichthyosaur you've just seen, which are displayed above. The second thing he managed to do was to provide enough money to remove the Society's meeting room and free up the Somerset room for museum displays by building a separate hall in the museum grounds. And I'd refer you to Lizzie to what present efforts to try and revive the Windham Hall to its original function as a community meeting space. Thirdly, he endowed enough money to build an entirely new wing on the museum. And to this day, it's called the Windham Gallery, and you'll find it just to the right-hand side of the present entrance to the Museum of Somerset. It was originally built at the upper floor here that you see is built in slightly different pattern of stonework as added in the 1950s. But the original structure was designed by Sir George Oakley, a well-known architect from Bristol. And I'm sure you will recognize him once I say he was the designer of that landmark that dominates the top of Park Street in Bristol, the University Tower. But this is a nice piece of architecture that we have in our own care. It's incidentally, the multi-party-coloured stonework is derived from meant to represent the variety of different building stones that were available then in the entire county. So this made an enormous difference to the amount of space that the museum had and to the way in which the society would go about its business. We have a lot to be grateful for. He also incidentally went on to found a number of educational trusts which still exist. Now, there was an interruption, of course, in 1939 with the Second World War. Evacuation of a lot of the most sensitive of our collections out to a country house where, unfortunately, the piping leaked and damage was done to the collections. So those people who inherited the castle and its collections immediately in the post-war period had a great challenge on their hands. Not only were the collections in desperate need of care and collection and sorting out and putting back within the context of the castle and the new facilities that Windham had made available to them, but also, of course, there were extensive building works required to building the castle up to scratch, and there was growing financial pressure on the costs of day-to-day maintenance, staff, collection care, the whole gamut. In fact, it must have cost somewhere in the region of about 20,000 a year in those days to actually run the castle complex, which is a great burden on society, one I think that society would struggle with even today. So the keepers, Seaby and his successor Sansom, had quite a job on their hands. It didn't mean that collecting stopped. In fact, one of the most spectacular acquisitions during this period was the decision to lift the newly discovered Lowham mosaic in 1953. And that, of course, now forms a pride of place in the Great Hall of the castle. And is this fantastic illustration of the visit of Aeneas to Dido in Carthage. And here you can see Aeneas eyeing up Dido, who's on the right, and Venus and her acolyte trying to broker the deal in the middle. And we all know it ended unhappy, didn't it? Now, important from the society's point of view, with helping relieve the pressure, to start with, the society started selling off parts of its estate. Castle Lodge, Highness Cottage had to go to provide the capital required. That still left the problem of actually finding enough money to run the castle complex, including the museum, and providing a service to the public. Fortunately, two local authorities came to the rescue, in the form of subsidies. The County Council, which of course was County Council of Somerset, going way beyond Bath in those days, and Taunton Borough Council. Taunton had a town council in its own right then, and it too actually provided a grant towards the running of the museum. And that helped a great deal. Eventually, this relationship with the county council particularly ended up in negotiations over a lease in August 1958, whereby the county council took over responsibility for the castle, that's its maintenance, its running costs, everything, and the collections, the museum collections. That was an important step, because from then on it meant that the county council was able to bring its attention to bear on expanding the potential of the collections, including particularly its educational potential. The chair of the Education Committee, Stephen Morland at the time, was very, very keen that the collections were used in such a way. And indeed, by the time I'd arrived in the museum service, a marvellous loan collection had been developed first by Frank Horton and then by Val Stevens. And it contained a whole wealth of material, which was regularly used not just in the museums themselves, but was also loaned out to schools on a half-termly basis all over Somerset. And over 2/3, and that's well over 250 schools, 2/3 of the schools in the county actually regularly avail themselves of this service. So the chances are, if you're of that generation in Somerset school at the time, you came across material like this, and well presented with backup information for the teachers to use. And teaching staff from all over Somerset and the advisory service, as it then was, were very much involved in the development of this service. Now, I must emphasize that the society, as part of the deal, formed part of the management of the continuing management of the castle and the museum, and the local history library for that matter. Two representatives of the society sat on first the Education Committee, and then when the library, Specialist Libraries, Museums and Records Committee was established in the 80s, two members actually sat on that right up until the end of the abolition of the committee system in about 2000. Our last two representatives were Dr. Philip Radford and the Reverend Brian Kirk. So the society was very much involved. And at council meetings at the society, there were the reports back, not only from our two representatives, but from one of the county councillors involved in the committees as well. So there was good two-way involvement in the management and development of collections. And what that means is that the county council were often able to put money into educational resources, but they also were able to, for example, accept the gift, magnificent gift by the Maxton family of the Abbey Barn and its associated farm buildings at Glastonbury. It took a further 4 years for the buildings to be conserved, and the particular problem here was the Abbey Barn. There was a bit of a kerfuffle over roofing it, but this magnificent complex formed the core of what became the Somerset Rural Life Museum. And believe it or not, you're looking at part of the collection here, because Showerings very kindly not only endowed the museum with its collection of cider apples, apple trees, but also actually looked after them for many years, saw to their maintenance. It provided endless entertainment for friends and staff, because the cider apples were actually properly pressed and turned to their proper function once a year. But it did mean for the first time that we were able to collect largish objects like farm machinery, for example, and indeed keep livestock, as you can see in the picture on the left. It also meant that we were able to cover aspects of Somerset's technical history. Now, not many people realise that this little boat that you see bobbing up and down in the middle of the River Avon on its way to the Festival of the Sea in Bristol is part of our collection of flatners. Now, a flatner is a peculiar form of boat that is only now made in Somerset, or was only made, it is now made in Somerset because it's been revived. But it's a type of construction that was used for peat boats, for inshore fishing vessels like this one that you see here, and a much larger scale vessel that was also used for providing leisure trips for tourists at Weston-super-Mare. Now, believe it or not, this type of vessel is the linear descendant and the only one surviving in this country of the medieval cog, which was the common form of medieval merchantmen in the medieval period. It's fascinating. It's far more seaworthy than you would imagine by first looking at it. But I could give you a whole lecture on that. No, I won't. Not now. It was also an opportunity to start collecting fairly large pieces of fine art, like the portrait here of the Honourable East India Company ship, Taunton Castle. This was actually built by Sir Benjamin Hammett, who at one time spent quite a lot of money in the 18th century on the castle and indeed on the adjoining buildings, which are now the Carthage County Hotel. And it used to be the Winchester Arms, so I'm not too sure what it's called now. But it was a wealth that was engendered by this ship. So this is an example of where you've got a ship portrait, quite a common form for the late 18th century, but here is an important local link to the story of the county museum. Now, to give you an idea of the collections, and I say the collections because really what happened in 1958, okay, the society retained ownership, in the inverted commas, trusteeship direct trusteeship of all the collections that had been acquired up to that date. From 1958, the County Council was responsible for most of the further collections, unless they were particularly endowed on the society. So in a way, when I refer to the county collections, they very much are a single collection. That's the only way you can really understand them when you're talking about their development and trying to understand how services can be developed from them. And you'll see that, I think, a bit later on when I come to the present day. Now, to give you an idea of what we're talking about in terms of sheer quantity, this was a rough diagram I drew up in 1988, which shows you the relative quantity of material that was held in the county collections as compared to the other types of museums in the post-1974 Somerset. And that includes the Fleet Air Arm Museum over on the right-hand side. You can see it's a substantial mass of material. Not surprisingly, when you look at the breakdown, most of that is archaeological. And it still is archaeological, and archaeology is growing simply to reflect the amount of redevelopment happening in the county to this day. And thanks to PPG 16, the process, it does mean a lot of the finds archaeological fieldwork produces material, the collections. But look at what the rest is. It's mostly biology. Good chunk of the rest is geology, but you've also then got things like numismatics, which are a very large chunk. But this is a misleading diagram, as are the last two, because what these do is attempt to quantify what is held in the collections. There are no indication of quality. In each of those collections, and I would say here, particularly the biology collections, the geology collections, the costume collections, the social history collections, And the oral history collections are material not only of regional significance to Somerset, but of national and international significance. And it is that wider community that we have to remember that our collections are held in trust. So such quantities have caused a lot of heartache, particularly on how to actually house them. And indeed, I think in the 80s, that was the biggest challenge that we faced, housing them and then documenting them. Lots of unsuitable premises had to be acquired, like the use of the keep here at Jalalabad Barracks and the redundant church at Kurland, just to simply put a roof over half of this stuff and put it behind lock and key. But it was far from ideal. Environmental conditions were not suitable, and it was difficult enough to get access for the staff, let alone the public. And I have to admit too, despite the best efforts of my predecessor, Phil Stevens, and his colleagues and my own colleagues, to refresh the displays in the County Museum, we were becoming conscious that they were looking dated and tired, no matter what we were able to do to try and jazz them up somewhat. And that led us then to the great challenge of the late part of the 20th century. How to find the resources to refresh the castle as a building complex and to refresh the museum. Now, it's interesting, if you look at the history of a society, this kind of crisis arises every 50 years. So it ought to, Lizzie, be in our strategic plan, because in another, 30 years now, we'll be facing a similar situation. Now, I have to say we were very, very fortunate as a society in having a president, Max Hebditch, who actually was far-sighted enough to see how we could go about facing this problem. Now, in those days, and indeed today, you can't just, as what most people regard as a relatively minor monument and a museum in the provinces, go along to people and expect to be able to gather hat loads of money in the way that the society could do in the mid-19th century. And so what Max did was he got together all the cultural organisations in Taunton and in collaboration with many beyond Taunton. And finally, in 2005, actually produced a report that would place the concept of a new museum in a context. And it's worth quoting. It's the Taunton Cultural Consortium published The Cultural Quarter, a catalyst for cultural regeneration and renewal in Taunton and Somerset, a report prepared for Somerset County Council, Taunton Deane Borough Council, the Regional Assembly, the South West Regional Development Agency, the Environment Agency, and lastly, the Vision for Taunton, which was the local team that had been got together and incidentally included representatives of the society. Now, this then actually made the case about why it was important for the cultural institutions of the county town to be fostered for the benefit of the county as a whole. And as a result of that, able to go to the Heritage Lottery Fund and secure support of no less than, look at me figures here again, it's 4.8 million towards a 6.8 million pound scheme. So that's a 6.8 million pound scheme went into refurbishing the castle. The society committed £35,000 of its own capital resources as a contribution to the project. And our then chairman, Hilary Binding, joined the project committee that was established to actually make sure the project was implemented. Architects, Field and Clegg were employed. A lot of people were actually involved, brought together then under the leadership of Tom Maybury to make sure that this project happened. Now, supplementary to that, through Vision for Taunton, the outside area was also improved. Castle Green was flattened, the car park was got rid of, part of it was planted out as a performance area, and the glass bridge was provided and really opened up the Windham Hall. Beforehand, it had been approached through a kind of narrow corridor that various nefarious things went on at night that we probably not wish to know about, but did mean effectively the Windham Hall was out of bounds for use after dark. The result is what you can see and enjoy today. It is enjoyed by over 50,000 visitors a year. Now, as an important thing to remember, in parallel with this, the County Council funded a lot of the ancillary work going on with the scheme. And that included the necessary archaeological fieldwork that was required to provide the new services, the new foundations for the structures in the Great Hall and so forth. And that team was led by Chris Webster. And he, as a result, published by the Society, produced this magnificent volume of Taunton Castle, which is a must for any trustee to read and everybody else really. It's to be dipped into, but it's a fascinating mine of information and everything you need to know about the castle complex. And of course, there are archaeological finds as a result, not very spectacular to some people's eyes, but here, for example, there's a pottery type series that's laid out that was used as an aid to getting the collection published. Now, the second important thing to remember about the dear old County Council is that they actually put into place a fairly long-term planned ambition of both the Record Society, the Record Office, and the County Museum Service to provide decent housing for our collections together in one place. They're not quite under one roof, but more or less near enough. The form now we know as the Somerset Heritage Centre. In the museum service, we'd have been acquiring through the County Council a number of industrial units over the years to replace the kind of premises that you saw earlier. Very interesting historical structures, to be sure, but we wanted proper housing to look after the collections, most importantly to repackage them and to document them properly so we can find the blooming things. And that, I know, gives a very boring appearance of rows and rows of boxes on shelves, but it is the important core of how you look after the majority of our collections to this day. And this indeed is a view of the entire interior of one of the stores in the Heritage Centre. So we were dragged into the 21st century in a very fit state, I must say, to face the future. Now, as part of the process of the reorganisation of local government that went on and is still going on to this day, we're now faced with having to establish a relationship with a new local authority, Somerset Council. But in 2014, in October that year, an agreement was finally thrashed out between society, the County Council, and basically our agreements, our legal agreements, and our relationship with the County Council remains as the core of this new arrangement. And with a third party, the South West Heritage Trust, which was founded predominantly to manage the heritage services of the County Council. In other words, the Historic Environment Services, Local History Library, the Record Office, and the museum, County Museum. And that is the arrangement we have today. The Society itself reorganised the way in which we interface with this new situation. Museum collection panel set up. We have as our members external expertise to provide that additional reassurance to our own trustees that we are providing the best advice possible to the board on how our museum collections are to be developed and cared for in the future. Primary job of this panel is to liaise with the staff of the South West Heritage Trust to formulate policy and strategic plans, to administer loans and transfers, the day-to-day bread and butter stuff, and also to manage the museum collection fund. And that has enabled us to conserve some of the objects in our collections, like the portrait you see here of Hannah Mellis, and most recently, the portrait of her brother, Edward, the boy with the squirrel. You can see the difference that £3,500 worth of conservation has made. Now, these portraits are due to go on display. They've been delayed by the pandemic, as you might imagine. So that is good ongoing work. Now, in addition, finally, can I turn to how it is that our collections are used and the importance of using them and making sure they're used. The museum staff are far less numerous than the Record Office staff, but nevertheless, they are performing a very important function as the interface between not only the society and its membership, but also the public as a large, and our collections and the collection at large. Just to show 3 examples. Since 1937, the Society was a co-founder of the South West Implement Petrology Committee. Now, I know a lot of these examples sound a bit nerdish, but it is important, I think, to show how focus on particular aspects of the collection can actually take us forward in quite important ways in providing better understanding of wider issues involved with the society and the society we serve. There are over 164 artifacts, polished stone axes in the collections. And through this medium, this joint venture funded by Historic England, we've been able to actually put online for the first time the examples of this type of artifact from all over the Southwest, together with short videos to explain what it is that the committee does and how it is that our work is actually changing our very fundamental ideas about the place of Somerset in the prehistoric world. Another example is a longer running research, the kind of focused, very tightly focused research program. The Society, right from our early days, started collecting what in those days was called a hortus siccus. In other words, they're pressed, dried and pressed plants, so they can be preserved. They're preserved a single species on single sheets, and they've accumulated over the years. But as you might imagine, some of them getting rather dog-eared after 110 years, 120 years. And thanks to the Somerset Rare Plant Group, who've been concentrating on the collection has not only been curated, in other words, it's been conserved, been repackaged, it's been reclassified where necessary. But this is the most important thing of all. It has been brought up to date. The Somerset Rare Plant Group aren't just curating a historic artifact, important though that is. What they're doing is adding new information to it. And I would refer you to back numbers of the current series of proceedings. And in there, if you look at the Rare Plant Group's report on dandelions, you can see, I know it sounds an awfully trivial subject, but it is important because it's making a very, very important statement. And that is that we, in all our pomposity as a generation think we know all about the Earth, in fact, are still finding new species on our own doorstep. Yes, on our own doorstep. And the rare plant group are proving it with dandelions. And these photographs, I'm grateful to Simon Leach, one of their members, for supplying. This is an example of the kind of sheet that has been added to the collection fairly recently. It's of the dandelions of the family Taraxica. This is Taraxicum atracalinum, which since it was identified first in December 2016, has been further identified as having fairly extensive coverage in southwest England, Wales, and even over the Channel in Ireland. And this will give you an example of how these are preserved in the collection. They've got the specimen itself, you've got the details at the top of what it is and how it is classified, and down the bottom, the details of the provenance and the collection method. And this is an example of a Taraxicum amicorum. And incidentally, it's the rare plant group that have been responsible for finding agreed names through the Linnaean system for these new species. This is a species that has just been found in Somerset so far. And again, is a recent 2016 discovery, and has been proclaimed worldwide as a discovery new to science in 2019. So this is a small dedicated group of people concentrating on an old collection, but updating it and providing us with a lot new data, which is relevant to the wider issues, of course, of climate change and many of the issues that are facing us as a society today. Now, to bore you with my own particular specialism of pottery, to go back to that photograph I showed earlier of the type series from Taunton Castle. I use this as an example of how we are using a major find of pottery sherds in the excavations at the castle to provide the foundations for a reference collection that is going to be of wider use, and already is of wider use, to the archaeological world as a whole, and indeed to a much wider world than that. It is based on the idea that you can actually identify pottery by the stuff that's in it, the fabric. And you can see from this thin section of a sherd here that there is stuff in the sherd. There's not only a matrix holding all the bits together, but there are quite noticeable inclusions, fragments of limestone, calcite in this particular instance, and also fragments of quartz in this instance as well. Now, when studying the finds from the castle, we teamed up with a group of people, Jens Anderson and Gavin Rollinson from the Camborne School of Mines, which is now part of the University of Exeter, to explore new ways of actually trying to understand how we can characterize the contents of pots. Back in the 1970s, Professor David Peacock was a pioneer in using the technique of thin sectioning. That is taking a geologically tight thin section to a sherd, as you see here, and using it to try to characterize different kinds of early medieval pottery. This is a late Saxon sherd dating from the 10th to 11th century, from the royal palaces at Cheddar. And he worked with Philip Raats, the excavator of that site, to get together a rudimentary classification for the pottery being found there. This pottery, of course, is still in museum collections and is capable of being back referred to today. So we're now in a better position to understand what's going on. This particular sample has been subject to two modern techniques of examination, chemical technique called ICP, which accounts for the little hole drilled in it, and the thin section itself, which thanks to a new device called the QEM scan, or automated scanning electron microscopy, we're able to actually overnight draw up a map of what's in a potsherd. And we are able, through the software, to interrogate this statistically to actually work out what its components are. Here you can see a sherd typical of the kind of pottery made at Donyat Site 13 down in South Somerset, excavated by Richard Coleman Smith. And you can see it's you can see the relationship. The beauty, I think, of this technique is you can see that immediately the relationship between the scans and the sherds. A bit difficult to do with ICP. And here's a colourful kaleidoscope of pottery sherds from the castle. And all these different colour variations are due to the different mineralogical makeup of the sherds concerned. Now, you may think this is awfully, but it actually has wider implications. Part of it is to contribute to a national network, national framework of reference collections, which Historic England are very keen to establish over the country. Why? To standardise terminology, because archaeologists have been pretty whimsical in ascribing names to some of these things and actually recognising where pottery occurs over the different parts of the country, let alone elsewhere in Europe and North America. It is important that we actually understand and provide a definitive classification, or near definitive as possible. And that then will lead to a better standard of pottery reporting. Better, if you look at pottery reports in the proceedings at the moment, you end up by wondering whether, if somebody's talking about Donyat ware, whether they really understand the term. And in fact, it's a term that we've now long since recognised as being outmoded. But nevertheless, it's a way of refining what we mean when we say certain things. And it has meant that we've been able to afford, through the scheme, taking on a part-time trainee, Naomi Payne, who started work in December. What it means on a broader scale is that, well, for somebody like me, I can actually now characterise and explain to you why this particular ware, which is made in various places in South Somerset, is so peculiar to that production centre. Why it is different from, say, the sgraffito ware that you get on here on the left-hand side, nice 18th century jug, is different from the sgraffito ware from North Devon, is different from the sgraffito ware from West Somerset, and is different from the sgraffito ware from West Somerset and from Crockerton in Wiltshire. And this technique you see here, this beautifully executed early 18th century dish you see in the middle, is a peculiar technique that was really refined by the potters in South Somerset. It's the use of wet slip. I find it staggering. It's so free and easy, so easily done, so striking. So I hope it is by such attention to detail that our collections are being reused, no matter how old they are being reused and revitalised for use today, in that getting not only a broader understanding of the charitable objects of the society, which is the understanding and knowledge of the archaeology and natural history of our county, but of a much wider community, in not only in Britain, but in a wider field in Northern Europe and indeed in the Americas. So we have a legacy to be proud of. We have a legacy that we need to nurture for the future. There are lots of administrative issues to be resolved, like what is going to happen when the new council come into full existence. Somerset Council will they actually still see it important to invest in into the society's future? That is all certain type of issue. But the main issue is that you, as individuals, can support the society through all its aspects of its work. And the museum collections is but one of them. I think one of the most important, but that's because I'm me. But nevertheless, it means that you can support this activity and make sure that it's there for our grandchildren in the future, for them to study and enjoy. Thank you. I'll hand over to Lizzie, and I'm very happy to answer questions.
Thank you, David. That was really a bit of a salutary tale, really, isn't it? It's just a huge amount of responsibility, but so much fun to be had. Yeah. And yeah, do everybody who's listening and anybody who might see it on YouTube, get involved. I mean, there are some wonderful people involved in SANHS. It's a fabulous society and has some wonderful collections. So, got a few questions coming up. Somebody would like to know where the owl in the picture has come from, David.
Well, once the Education Loan Service had developed across serving so many schools across the county, we found that we were being the recipients of a lot of corpses that school children were bringing in. Now, unfortunately, an enormous cull of our wildlife is taken by collisions with cars, bicycles, power lines. Lots of things can endanger a poor little bird in its flight. And some of the better preserved specimens we got specially mounted and added back into the school loan service. Now, I emphasize these are not gone out and been shot, like unfortunately I've got a feeling the Great Bustard was. These are actual casualties of our modern life. And fortunately, for many years, we had the services of a superb taxidermist in North Devon, Paul Rose, who is brilliant at actually taking cadavers like this and turning them back into life.
Do we still have an educational loan service?
Yes,
we do, yeah.
But it's unfortunately not available free to schools anymore because of well, you know what's happened to education. I mean, everything, there is no county education service as such anymore. And schools are expected to provide resources for everything out of their own.
Yeah, yeah, but nice to know it's still there and still possible. So we got a question here that says, what do you consider William Bidgood and Harold St. George Grey would think of what has happened to SANHS today? Do you think it reflects the future that they envisaged of the society?
Well, to take it back a stage further, I think I think our very first president would be incredibly gratified about where we've got to. And I must admit, this is probably highly confidential, but when I was treasurer, we were subject to an investigation by the Charity Commission. And I was taken aside and I was told, and then this has nothing to do with me because it's my predecessors who are responsible for this, that we as a society have been highly successful in managing to, how shall I say it, share the pecuniary burden of our tremendous assets with so many other different organisations. So we didn't have to bear them ourselves. And I think that was a primary achievement, I think, that Trevelyan certainly would have recognised, and Bidgood and George Grey indeed.
Yes.
We've got to somehow very cherish that and nurture it so that we've got the financial robustness
Exactly. I mean, it is quite a burden having an awful lot of buildings to look after, and well done to SANHS for having found a way to do that. And also the society has got such a huge remit, isn't it? It's not like we just do archaeology or just buildings. We do so many different things, and do it really well, actually.
Yes, I mean, I think, as you know, I also think our proceedings are an important part of what we do.
Absolutely.
It isn't until you undertake field work elsewhere in the country, as I did recently in Wales, that you realise that there is absolutely nowhere that will actually publish what you've done.
Yeah, yeah, it's very difficult. Yeah.
But here in the Southwest, we're blessed with this network. We may be old-fashioned in that sense, but we have this network of county societies that are still flourishing and still publishing.
Absolutely, the record is there.
Yeah, and I would just chip in that over 140 people contribute to every edition of the proceedings, which will give you an idea of how much it is a communal effort.
Yeah, absolutely, and really a good read, actually, oddly enough. Okay, so we got another one. Where were the fragile artifacts from the collection evacuated to during World War II? And did all the artifacts come back? Would you know this, David?
I used to know it. I can't remember the name of the manhouse offhand, and indeed there are other premises. It was a sad feature of the time. A lot of things ended up from museums all over the country, railway tunnels, country house basements. And of course, the country houses themselves tended to be requisitioned for military purposes. So whether everything that went in came back out again, we will never know.
No, interesting. Yeah, so I've got to, somebody said thank you very much for this fantastic talk, and we can an open invite for the society to post on Armchair Archaeology, which apparently is on Facebook, so I'll go and have a look at that one. And another one here, David, would David recommend to go and see Roman pottery, firstly in Somerset but also elsewhere? Where would you recommend to go and look for Roman pottery?
What, look at reference material. Museum of Somerset is a good starting point.
Yeah.
If you're looking at sites, there's Roman pottery all over the blooming stuff. It's just
absolutely.
More in some places than others.
Yeah. So I think that's probably about it now. I think we've come to the end of the questions. I'm very glad that you've made this recording, David, because I think it's so important to try to write down the history of the society. It's something, a good overview like that is something that's so easily lost. And I think, very glad that we'll be able to put this on YouTube and also onto the SANHS website for everybody to watch in the future. I'll be able to advertise it on Facebook for you as well. So thank you very much indeed.
Great pleasure.
So don't forget, people, that there are some fabulous books about the society that are available through the SANHS office and also through the website, including Chris Webster's Taunton Castle and various other bits and pieces that are really they're good value as well. Yeah, really worth reading. So in the future, we've got a few future events coming up. No webinars, but we have the local history committee are taking a tour around the bits of medieval Exeter on next Saturday, the 19th at 2 o'clock. And on the 2nd of July, the Historic Buildings Committee will be going around Bridgewater. We've got a tour by David Baker and Chris Sidaway, who will be showing us some of the older and more interesting aspects of Bridgewater, because actually it's a really interesting place to go to. So it only leaves me to thank everybody for coming along today, particularly David, who's put an enormous amount of effort into that talk. And of course, the webinar team, Nathanael, Tony and Harriet. And thank you, of course, for coming along today. And hopefully we'll see you again at another SANHS event or SANHS webinar. So Thank you and good night.